Hello and welcome back to the Sleepy Geographer. Tonight we're taking a gentle journey through one of the driest places on Earth, exploring a landscape where the absence of rain has quietly shaped the land, the life, and even the way people have learned to understand it. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always enjoy seeing people from all around the world joining these peaceful journeys. Now, get comfortable, settle in, and let's begin. Picture a single grain of sand, not attached to anything, not part of a dune, not caught inside a riverbed, not tumbling anywhere at all. Just one grain, resting on its own, somewhere on a stretch of ground so still that nothing has moved it in longer than most living things could survive waiting to find out. It has a shape to it. If you looked closely enough, edges worn down over a stretch of time that would make an entire human life look like the length of one slow breath. It has been sitting in that exact position, on that exact patch of ground, through so many identical, unremarkable days that the days themselves have stopped mattering to it in any way at all. No footprint has ever landed near it. No raindrop has ever struck it. Whatever wind occasionally passes over it moves too gently, most days, to carry it anywhere new. Tonight we're going to follow the story of a place built almost entirely out of grains like that one. A place where the sky rarely, if ever, delivers water, where the ground remembers nearly everything that has ever touched it because almost nothing ever does, and where, in a few quiet corners, something manages to keep living anyway, patiently, without needing anyone to notice. This is the Atacama Desert. Let go, for a moment, of whatever picture usually arrives in your mind when you hear that word, desert. Most people picture heat first. Shimmering air, dunes rolling out toward a horizon that never seems to cool. The Atacama has some of that, here and there, in patches, but underneath it, the real story isn't about heat at all, it's about absence. The absence of clouds drifting overhead, the absence of moisture arriving from anywhere nearby, the absence, across huge stretches of it, of nearly anything happening in the sky above, day after day, for stretches of time so long that the sky itself starts to feel like part of the ground rather than something separate hanging above it, watching. It runs along the northern edge of Chile, pressed into a long, narrow strip of land squeezed between two much larger forces. To the west, the Pacific Ocean, cold and wide, and close enough that you can sometimes catch salt in the air, even standing on ground that hasn't felt rain in longer than any calendar could properly track. To the east, the Andes, rising slope after slope, until the land itself seems to simply run out of room to climb any higher. Somewhere in the quiet space between those two enormous presences, the desert exists almost like an accident. Not a place shaped by too much sun, but a place shaped by exactly what happens when an ocean and a mountain range agree, without ever meaning to keep every last drop of moisture from ever settling onto the same stretch of ground at the same time. If you traveled through it slowly, starting near the coast, the desert wouldn't announce itself right away. Near the shoreline, there's a strip where fog drifts in most mornings, thick and pale, settling low over the hills before the sun eventually thins enough of it away to reveal dry, rocky slopes underneath, damp for only a little while, then dry again by midday. Fishing towns sit here and there along this stretch, small and quiet, the kind of places where boats rest on sand that never quite dries out completely, even though rain, real rain, hasn't touched any of it in longer than the oldest resident could say for certain. This coastal strip is dry, certainly, but it isn't the driest part of what we're following tonight. That waits further in, as the coast falls away behind you and the land opens into something wider and flatter. Gravel, salt crust, reddish stone stretching out toward the base of the mountains still far in the distance. This is the interior, the wide, open basin at the center of everything, flat in places for stretches that feel almost unreasonable to walk across. The ground repeating itself for so long that a person on foot might start to wonder whether they're making any progress at all. Broken, elsewhere, by low ridges of rock rising for no clear reason and leading nowhere in particular, standing quietly against a sky that offers no clouds to measure them against. And nearly without colour, at least not the kind of colour most landscapes wear. Tan, rust, pale grey, shifting only slightly depending on the hour, depending on how the light happens to be falling that particular afternoon. At certain times of day, right before the light finally goes soft and orange near the horizon, the whole basin can look almost like the surface of something that was never quite finished, left in a rough, early draft of a shape and simply never returned to. Keep moving inland and the ground begins, slowly, to climb. You barely notice it at first, then you do. Then you find yourself standing on a plain resting well above where you started, the air itself feeling different around you now. Thinner. Colder at night in a way that surprises almost everyone who arrives expecting only heat, wrapping a jacket tighter around themselves under a sky that only hours before had been merciless with sunlight. This is the high desert, stretched along the base of the mountains, at an elevation where volcanic cones rise even further above you, some of them resting quietly and completely still, others breathing out the faintest wisp of steam now and then into a sky so clear it seems almost impossible that weather of any kind could ever hide behind it. Herds of small, long-necked animals sometimes move across these high plains in loose groups, grazing on whatever thin grass manages to survive at this elevation, paying no attention at all to how strange it is that anything survives here. By the time the sun starts sinking toward the western edge of all this, the temperature can drop faster than anything a person used to gentler climates might expect. Heat that felt almost unbearable only an hour before slips away quietly once the light goes low and orange, and by full dark, the same stretch of ground that scorched through the afternoon can feel closer to winter than summer, the warmth it held onto all day escaping straight up into a sky with nothing overhead to trap it and send it back down again. There are no clouds most nights to hold that heat close to the surface the way clouds do almost everywhere else. There is only open air, thin and clear, letting the day's warmth rise up and away until it disappears completely, leaving the ground to cool the way a stone cools once it's finally lifted out of the sun. And somewhere within this long stretch of coast, plain and plateau, there is a center, a core. A patch of ground so consistently, relentlessly dry that people studying it eventually needed a different word entirely to describe what they were looking at. Not simply dry, the way we usually mean dry, the way a lawn goes dry in late summer before the next storm eventually arrives to soften it again. Something else, something drier than that, in a category almost entirely its own. Patches within this core have gone without any measurable rain for stretches of time that outlast entire human lives start to finish. Not an occasional light shower. Not the freak storm that even the driest deserts elsewhere sometimes experience once or twice a decade, almost apologetically, as though embarrassed to have let one slip through. Nothing. Just silence, in the truest sense the sky is capable of offering. Let that settle for a moment before we go any further. Somewhere out there, right now, ground is resting under a sky that has not opened, not once, not even briefly, in longer than anyone nearby has been alive to notice. There is something almost peaceful in that, once you stop thinking of it as strange and start thinking of it simply as still. A whole landscape that has gradually stopped expecting water from the sky. To understand how one particular stretch of coastline ended up this dry, out of everywhere else the sun happens to touch, it helps to picture the two forces pressing in on it from either side, quietly, patiently, neither one alone quite enough to create something this complete, but together forming something almost like a closed door with no handle on either side. Start with the mountains, because their part in this is the gentler one to picture. As moist air moves toward the Andes, the mountains slowly lift it higher. The air cools as it rises, and the moisture it carries begins to fall away as rain and snow along the mountain slopes. By the time the air has crossed the highest ridges and begins descending toward the Atacama, much of its moisture has already been released. What reaches the desert is therefore remarkably dry air, carrying very little water with it. This is what's called a rain shadow, and the Andes cast one of the most complete versions of it found anywhere on the planet. Moist air moving in from the interior of the continent, or drifting westward from the Great Green Basin further east, runs directly into that wall of mountains and has no choice but to climb. Climbing, it cools. Cooling, it releases whatever water it was carrying, feeding lush slopes and winding rivers on the far side, an entirely different world existing just beyond a ridge that, from the desert side, looks like nothing more than a distant line of jagged grey. And by the time whatever thin remainder of that air finally spills over the highest ridgelines, heading toward the Pacific side, there is almost nothing left inside it. The mountains already took what they were going to take, the way a toll booth takes its share before ever letting anything continue on its way. What finally arrives, settling down over the desert floor far below, is air that has been wrung out completely. Dry in a way that no further amount of travelling is ever going to change, no matter how far it still has left to drift. That alone would be enough to explain a great deal of what happens here. But there's a second force at work too, quieter, working from the opposite direction entirely, and this one comes not from the mountains at all, but from the ocean resting right alongside the coast, close enough to see, close enough to smell, and yet somehow offering almost nothing at all in return for its closeness. Just offshore, the Humboldt Current carries unusually cold water northward along the coast. Because this water remains cool, it releases much less moisture into the atmosphere than warm tropical water normally would. The Pacific is close enough to touch, yet much of its moisture never makes the journey inland as rainfall. Instead, the cool current helps maintain the dry air that settles over the coast. What the cold water produces instead is often fog. Known locally as Camanchaca, this coastal mist can drift quietly over the hills in the morning, leaving a fine layer of moisture on rocks and plants before the sunlight gradually dissolves it. It is one of the few ways water reaches parts of the Atacama without arriving as rain. So the ocean, instead of feeding this coastline with rain, helps keep it dry. Its cold current limits the moisture entering the atmosphere, while the mountains remove much of what arrives from the east, taking moisture out of the air before it ever gets the chance to drift inland at all. And the mountains, rising on the far side, strip away whatever moisture might still be arriving from the opposite direction, from deep within the continent. Two separate, unrelated systems, each working alone, each arriving, without ever intending to, at exactly the same outcome. Air left over this land with nothing left to give it, no matter which direction it happens to be travelling from, stands somewhere near the centre of the driest core of all this, and you can almost feel both forces at once, even without knowing anything about how either one works. Look west, and past low reddish hills you might just make out a pale haze sitting low on the horizon where the coastal fog is gathering, too far off to ever reach where you're standing. Look east, and the mountains rise in a long, uneven wall, their upper slopes quietly catching whatever storms happen to be forming on the far side of the continent, storms that will never make it over that ridge to reach you, no matter how long you wait for them. Between those two barriers, the air simply rests. Day after day, it brings very little moisture with it and leaves very little behind. The desert remains beneath it, quiet and dry, receiving almost nothing from the sky. It's worth sitting for a moment with what that actually means for the ground itself, because the consequences reach further than simply an absence of puddles or rivers or green things growing along a hillside. Rain, almost everywhere else the sun reaches, is constantly doing quiet work. It wears down rock, patiently, one storm at a time. It carves valleys, a little more with each passing season. It carries loose material from higher ground down toward rivers, and eventually oceans, reshaping the surface again and again in a process that never really pauses anywhere with anything close to a normal amount of rainfall. Here, that process has almost gone quiet. Without regular rainfall, the landscape changes extraordinarily slowly. Whatever shape the ground happened to hold the last time real erosion touched, it has, across huge stretches of this core desert, simply stayed that way, undisturbed, because there's nothing arriving regularly enough to ever reshape it again, nothing to smooth an edge or fill a low spot or carry anything anywhere new. This is part of what makes the place feel, to anyone actually standing inside it, less like an ordinary desert and more like some kind of pause pressed into the surface of the planet and left there far longer than seems reasonable. Long enough that entire landscapes elsewhere on Earth have risen, worn down, and risen again in roughly the same stretch of time. This one has simply sat still, undisturbed, waiting for a change that never quite arrives. Rock formations that would have softened and rounded off under ordinary rainfall instead stay sharp along their edges, holding almost exactly the texture they had the moment they first formed, whenever that was. Ground that would have been carried off somewhere else by a river instead simply stays where it is, one thin layer settling quietly over another, undisturbed by anything except the patient hand of the wind, which works far more gently and far more gradually than water ever does, smoothing things by fractions too small to notice across a single visit. Even the sound of the place, if you can call it that, reflects this same absence. Walk across the open basin at midday, and there's rarely a breath of wind strong enough to whistle past your ears the way wind does almost everywhere else. No rustle of leaves because there are so few leaves anywhere nearby to rustle. No distant murmur of a stream finding its way downhill because there hasn't been a stream here in longer than anyone could measure. What's left, mostly, is a kind of pressing quiet, broken only by the occasional loose stone shifting slightly under your own footstep, a sound that seems to carry further than it has any right to, simply because there is nothing else nearby competing with it for attention. And that particular kind of stillness, born not from cold and not from remoteness, but simply from the plain fact that water almost never arrives here at all, is where this quiet story is really heading tonight. Because once you understand what it actually means for a landscape to go this long without rain in exactly this way, you start to understand why this narrow strip of coastline has become one of the strangest, most closely studied places anywhere the sun happens to fall. A landscape so completely, consistently dry that people studying entirely different worlds much further away than any ocean or mountain range could ever reach, have found themselves drawn here too, kneeling down in the dust, looking closely at ground that, in a few very particular ways, doesn't resemble anywhere else on this planet at all. For now, just let the shape of everything we've passed through tonight settle quietly into place, the way dust settles once the wind that carried it finally dies down and moves on somewhere else. A narrow strip of land caught between a cold current that won't let moisture rise and a wall of mountains that won't let moisture pass. Two separate, patient systems, indifferent to each other, working side by side for a stretch of time long enough to build something this dry, this still, this completely without hurry. Somewhere out there right now, that single grain of sand is still resting exactly where it has rested for longer than anyone could easily guess, not waiting for anything, not expecting anything to change. Simply resting, the way everything in this particular corner of the world seems to rest, under a sky that has learned, over a very long stretch of time, to keep almost everything it carries close to itself, and let almost none of it fall. There's a particular kind of silence that only settles over ground once enough time has passed without rain, and the Atacama, more than almost anywhere else the sun touches, has had time to settle fully into that kind of quiet. To understand it, it helps to set aside, for a moment, the ordinary meaning most of us give to the word dry. Somewhere you've lived, at some point, has probably gone through a dry spell. A summer without much rain. A season that dragged on longer than it should have before a storm finally broke it. That kind of dry has an ending built into it already, even while it's happening. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you know rain is coming eventually, because rain always eventually comes. Here, that assumption simply doesn't hold. Certain patches of ground within this desert's driest core haven't recorded a single drop of rain in longer than any living person could verify from memory alone. Weather stations set up specifically to measure rainfall in some of these places have sat through decades of recording without ever once needing to write down a number greater than 0. Not because the instruments failed, not because nobody was watching, simply because nothing ever fell for them to measure. There's a quiet word geographers use when ordinary dry no longer seems enough: hyper-arid. It sounds almost clinical, but here it begins to feel less like a category and more like a description of the air itself, so light and empty of moisture that you can almost forget water was ever meant to be there. Stand quietly in the middle of one of these stretches, and the dryness of the air becomes almost impossible not to notice. There is so little moisture around you that the atmosphere itself seems unusually light and empty. The air moves gently across the open ground, carrying almost nothing with it, while the landscape remains beneath it, quiet and unchanged. Picture, for a moment, what an average year would look like almost anywhere else with any claim to being a desert. Even the driest deserts most people have heard of, the wide dune fields of the Sahara, the open plains of the Australian outback, still receive rain most years. Not much, sometimes barely enough to notice, but enough, over time, for a riverbed to occasionally run, for a shallow lake to occasionally fill, for the ground itself to remember, at least once every few seasons, what it feels like to be touched by water falling from above. In the driest heart of the Atacama, even those traces of water become extraordinarily faint. It isn't that rain here is rare. It's that rain here is, for all practical purposes, absent. A stretch of coastline and plateau existing under a sky that has, in certain specific pockets, essentially stopped participating in the water cycle altogether, watching the rest of the planet's weather happen somewhere else, at a comfortable distance, without ever joining in. This absence carries a particular consequence that becomes clear the moment you start looking for rivers. Nearly every landscape on Earth, however dry, still carries some trace of a river system somewhere within it. A dry riverbed, at least holding the memory of water even when no water happens to be moving through it at the moment you're standing there. A network of gullies, cut long ago by storms that may not have repeated themselves in years, but that clearly happened once because the ground still bears the shape of them. Across enormous stretches of the Atacama's core, even that faint memory doesn't exist. The ground simply never had enough water pass over it at any point to carve so much as a shallow channel. Where a riverbed would normally sit, waiting patiently for its next rare flood, there's often nothing at all. Just flat, undisturbed ground, exactly as level and exactly as untouched as it apparently was before anyone thought to measure it. Standing in the middle of one of these stretches, you can look in every direction and find no sign that water has ever, in any organized way, passed through at all. No smooth stones rounded by a current. No sediment sorted by size the way flowing water always eventually sorts it. Just gravel and dust, resting precisely where it settled the last time anything disturbed it, which, in some of these places may have been longer ago than anyone can properly account for. There's a particular quality to walking across ground like this. You start to notice how little the landscape seems to be waiting for anything. Elsewhere, dry ground still carries a kind of readiness about it, a shape built by rain even in rain's absence, gullies and channels standing empty but clearly built to carry something eventually. Here, the ground has no such shape. It was never built by water in the first place, because water was never present long enough, or often enough, to build anything at all. What you're standing on is simply what accumulated, grain by grain, gust by gust, over a stretch of time so uninterrupted that it stopped being a landscape shaped by weather and became, instead, something closer to a landscape shaped by the complete absence of it. Occasionally, in certain low pockets, you can find the faintest trace of something that might, once, have been a channel. A slight dip in the gravel, a subtle curve running for a short distance before disappearing again into flat ground on either side. Geologists studying these traces believe some of them may date back to a distant period when the climate here behaved differently, when a little more moisture drifted in from somewhere before the current arrangement of ocean current and mountain wall fully settled into place. Whatever water once moved through these shallow curves finished its work an unthinkably long time ago, and left behind nothing more than this faint suggestion, a memory so old and so thin that it barely counts as a memory at all anymore, more like the last trace of a dream someone struggles to recall the moment they wake. Scientists studying certain surfaces here have found soil that appears to have remained essentially undisturbed for longer than almost anywhere else they've measured on the planet's surface. Not simply dry soil sitting on top of older dry soil, the same soil, resting in the same position since a point in the past distant enough that trying to hold the number comfortably in your mind starts to feel a little like trying to hold water in an open hand. Layers of salt, mineral crusts, thin sheets of gypsum have been allowed to build up on the surface here in ways that would be washed away within a single normal rainy season almost anywhere else on Earth. Here, with nothing ever arriving to wash them away, they've simply stayed, thickening with an unhurried patience that has no real equivalent anywhere ordinary rainfall reaches. It's a strange kind of preservation, though not the kind involving ice or cold. This is preservation through simple neglect, the ground left alone by the sky for so long that whatever shape it settled into early on has had almost no reason to ever change. There's something worth sitting with quietly in that thought, lying here tonight. Somewhere out there, right now, under a completely clear sky, there is ground that has not been touched by rain since before anyone currently alive was born, and quite possibly since before their parents or their parents' parents were born either. Not resisting the rain, not surviving some ongoing hardship, simply existing in a place rain has, in any meaningful sense, forgotten to visit. Local wells and small mining settlements scattered near the edges of this dry core rely, almost entirely, on water carried in from elsewhere, piped across long distances from sources near the mountains or drawn up from aquifers resting far below the surface. Aquifers that, in this particular part of the world, hold water old enough that it likely settled underground during a distant period when the climate above behaved rather differently than it does now. Nothing about daily life out here assumes rain will ever arrive on its own. Every drop that reaches a tap, or a trough, or a small patch of tended green near a settlement has already travelled a long way to get there, carried by pipe or truck rather than by cloud. And it's this particular quality, this specific combination of extreme dryness and extreme stillness, layered over ground old enough that its own history has stopped being countable in any ordinary way, that eventually drew a very different kind of visitor to this stretch of coastline. Not settlers looking for water, because there was none to find, not travelers passing through towards somewhere greener, but people studying an entirely different planet altogether, one considerably further away than any ocean or mountain range, who found, when they finally arrived here in person, that the ground beneath their boots looked uncomfortably familiar. And from here, the desert begins to resemble somewhere far beyond Earth. For now, let the shape of this stillness settle a little further. A landscape where permanent rivers are almost completely absent. Ground that has kept its shape not through any effort of its own, but simply because almost nothing has ever arrived with enough water to ask it to change. There's a particular colour certain parts of this desert turn toward in the hour just before midday, when the sun sits almost directly overhead and the light stops casting any real shadow at all. A flat, reddish-brown, dusted here and there with a paler grey, stretching out across ground broken only by scattered rock and the occasional low ridge rising just enough to interrupt the horizon before falling back down into more of the same. It's a colour that, described on its own, wouldn't sound like anything particularly unusual. And yet, photographed from the right angle, under the right light, this exact stretch of ground has been mistaken, more than once, for images sent back from somewhere else entirely. This is the part of the story where the Atacama starts to feel less like a place on this planet and more like a rehearsal for somewhere else. Certain regions within the desert's driest interior share a resemblance to the surface of Mars close enough that it isn't simply a passing impression. Scientists who study that planet, and who someday hope to send people to walk across it, have spent real time out here, kneeling in the same dust anyone else might kneel in, running instruments across ground chosen specifically because it behaves in several important ways, like ground that has never once felt an ocean, or a river, or meaningful rainfall of any kind. Part of this comes down to simple colour and texture. Iron minerals scattered through much of this soil oxidize slowly under the relentless sun, the same basic chemical process that turns metal rusty when left out in the weather, producing a reddish tint across huge stretches of ground that, from a distance or from above, looks remarkably close to the reddish surface photographs sent back from the other planet's own dust and rock. Fine particles here have been ground down by wind alone, over a stretch of time so uninterrupted by rain that they've never had the chance to clump together, or wash into rivers, or settle into the kind of layered soil that forms almost everywhere else water plays even a small role in shaping the ground. But the resemblance runs deeper than simple colour into something quieter and less visible. Soil chemistry, tested carefully in certain patches of this desert's most extreme interior, has revealed something unusual. Nearly every soil sample taken almost anywhere else on Earth, however dry the surrounding climate might be, still carries some trace of organic material within it, some faint chemical signature left behind by whatever life, however small or scattered, has managed to exist nearby at some point. Here, in a small number of specific locations, researchers have found soil so thoroughly stripped of that signature that it registers, on certain tests, as closer to what instruments expect to find on a planet with no life at all than to what they'd expect from anywhere else on this one. This isn't because life has never touched this soil. It's because whatever trace life leaves behind, elsewhere on Earth, tends to get carried, mixed, and redistributed by water moving through the ground, by rain soaking down and stirring things together, by rivers carrying organic material from one place and depositing it somewhere else. Here, with none of that mixing ever happening, whatever faint trace of life does exist stays exactly where it landed, in concentrations too thin and too undisturbed to register clearly against a backdrop this dry, this untouched, this thoroughly abandoned by ordinary weather. For exactly this reason, this stretch of ground has become something close to a rehearsal space. Instruments eventually meant to travel to Mars itself, meant to search that planet's own soil for any trace of water or any faint signature of life have been tested here first, driven slowly across gravel and dust chosen specifically because it offers, as closely as anywhere on this planet reasonably can, a preview of exactly the kind of silence those instruments will eventually need to listen through, somewhere far beyond where any of us will ever stand ourselves. There's something quietly moving in that image if you let yourself sit with it for a while. A stretch of ground on this planet, dry enough and undisturbed enough that people preparing to search an entirely different planet for the faintest whisper of water or life have chosen it, specifically as their closest available comparison. Not because this ground is truly like Mars in every sense. The air here still holds oxygen. Gravity here still pulls the way it always has. But in the particular quality of its dryness, in the particular thoroughness of its silence, this small stretch of coastline manages something almost no other place on Earth can. It offers a glimpse, standing on solid, breathable ground, of what true and lasting absence actually feels like. The comparison holds up even in the smaller details, the ones easy to miss unless you're looking closely. Certain minerals found scattered through this soil, sulfates and clays formed under conditions of extreme dryness rather than through any interaction with liquid water, closely resemble minerals detected by rovers examining the surface of Mars itself from many millions of kilometers away. Researchers who study one often find themselves, before long, studying the other as well, comparing samples gathered by hand here against readings sent back from instruments crawling across entirely foreign ground, looking for whatever quiet similarities might help explain how a planet, any planet, ends up this dry in the first place, and what such dryness might mean for whatever traces of water, or life might still be waiting somewhere within it. Walk across one of these test sites in the early morning, before the day's heat has fully settled in, and the ground crunches slightly underfoot in a way that feels almost brittle, dry past the point of holding any real give at all. Look down, and the soil breaks into loose, angular pieces rather than crumbling into anything soft, holding onto sharp edges the way it might have held them the very first day it settled into place, whenever that particular day happened to be. There's a stillness to it that goes beyond simple silence. Even disturbed, even kicked loose by a careless footstep, the dust here seems to settle back down almost immediately, without the slightest hesitation, as though it has done exactly this, in exactly this way, more times than it could possibly begin to count. Small robotic rovers, prototypes of the kind eventually sent to roll across the actual surface of Mars, have crossed this same ground on slow test runs, their wheels leaving thin tracks in gravel that, in some of these more remote patches, no human foot had disturbed in longer than anyone could confirm. Watching one of those small machines move across ground this quiet, this thoroughly emptied of moisture, it becomes a little easier to understand why researchers keep returning here rather than simulating this dryness somewhere closer to home. Certain kinds of silence, it turns out, are difficult to fake convincingly. They have to be found in a place that has genuinely earned them, over a stretch of time that no laboratory could ever properly compress into something shorter. There's a particular comfort, oddly enough, in knowing a place like this exists. Not because the emptiness itself is comforting, exactly, but because of what it suggests about patience, about how completely a landscape can settle into stillness if simply left alone by the sky for long enough. This ground isn't struggling against its own dryness. It isn't fighting to survive some ongoing drought the way a struggling farm field might be, waiting anxiously for a storm that keeps almost arriving and never quite does. It has, in a sense, made peace with its own condition, settling fully and completely into what it is rather than what it might become if the rain ever finally decided to return. At night, Once the test vehicles have been switched off and the researchers have retreated to whatever shelter they've set up nearby, the ground here goes through the same steep drop in temperature found across the rest of this high, open country. Heat that gathered across the metal of a small rover's frame all day slips away quickly once the sun disappears, leaving surfaces cold enough to the touch that anyone checking on the equipment overnight learns quickly to bring gloves. It's a detail that matters more than it might first seem. Any world dry enough, and empty enough, and thin enough in its own atmosphere to hold on to almost none of its daytime warmth after dark tends to share this same pattern, scorching under direct sun and then losing nearly everything the moment the sun finally sets. Standing between a rover cooling under starlight and the empty sky above it, it becomes easy, for a moment, to forget which planet you're technically still standing on. And it's worth remembering, resting here tonight, that this same reddish ground, tested by instruments built to search another world for the faintest trace of water, sits only a short distance, as these things go, from an ocean that never stops moving at all. The same stretch of coastline holding both the driest ground most instruments will ever be tested on, and, only a little further west, water stretching out toward a horizon with no end in sight. It's a strange kind of neighbouring. Two conditions this different resting so close beside each other, separated by nothing more than the quiet, patient work of a current and a mountain range that decided, long before anyone thought to measure any of it, exactly how much moisture would be allowed to pass between them. For now, let that reddish ground settle into your thoughts the way dust settles once disturbed and then, almost immediately, left alone again. Somewhere out there, small wheels are resting on gravel colder tonight than it was this afternoon. Tracks left behind by a machine built to eventually roll across ground even further away, even quieter, even more thoroughly emptied of everything except stone and light, and the occasional passing shadow of a cloud that, on this world at least, never quite manages to arrive. As darkness settles fully over the high plateau, the same dryness that has shaped the ground below begins to reveal something very different overhead. It goes clear. Not clear the way a nice evening back home might be clear, with a handful of stars visible if you know where to look, and the moon washing out most of the fainter ones anyway. Clear in a way that takes most visitors several long minutes to actually process, standing with their heads tipped back, mouths slightly open, trying to work out why the sky in front of them looks so much more crowded than any sky they've stood beneath before. Lie back on a blanket, spread across the gravel, up here where the plateau climbs highest before the mountains take over completely, and the first thing you notice isn't any single star. It's the sheer number of them, scattered edge to edge in every direction, filling gaps that most skies leave empty, gaps a person's eye usually fills in with nothing but flat, featureless dark. Here, that dark keeps revealing more of itself the longer you look, faint points resolving out of what first appeared to be blank space, until the whole thing starts to feel less like a night sky and more like a fine dust of light scattered across black cloth, so dense in places that it blurs into a pale, glowing band stretching from one horizon to the other. That pale band is our own galaxy, seen edge on, and back where most of us live, city light and haze and moisture in the air keep it hidden most nights. A soft rumour rather than something you could actually point to. Up here, it stops being a rumour. It becomes a shape you can trace with your eyes, thick through the middle and thinning gradually toward either end, close enough in appearance to something solid that a few visitors, seeing it for the first time, quietly assume they're looking at a distant cloud before someone nearby gently tells them otherwise. To understand why the sky bothers to reveal itself this completely in exactly this location and almost nowhere else quite like it, you have to go back, once again, to the same absence that shaped everything else in this desert. water vapor, drifting through the air almost everywhere else on Earth, does something to starlight that most people never think to notice because they've simply never stood anywhere dry enough to compare it against. Moisture in the atmosphere scatters light slightly as it passes through, blurring and softening it, the same way a pane of frosted glass softens whatever sits on the other side of it. Most nights, most places, that blurring happens quietly enough that nobody thinks to blame it for anything. The stars still look like stars. They just look a little dimmer, a little less sharp than they otherwise could. Up on this plateau, there's almost no water vapor left in the air to do any of that softening. The same dryness that strips rain out of the sky before it ever reaches the ground also strips away nearly everything capable of scattering starlight on its way down. What arrives at your eye, lying here, is about as close to unfiltered as light gets after crossing whatever distance it happened to travel, arriving sharp-edged and steady rather than smeared by moisture the way it would be almost anywhere with a normal, damp atmosphere sitting overhead. Altitude plays its own quiet part in this too. The air up here is thinner than the air most people breathe every day, and thinner air means less of it sitting between your eyes and space itself. Less atmosphere overall for starlight to have to push through before it reaches you. Combine that thinness with the near total absence of moisture, and you end up with air that behaves less like a soft filter and more like plain, empty window glass, doing almost nothing at all to the light passing through it besides letting it arrive. There's a stillness to the air here too, beyond simply its dryness, that matters just as much to how steady the stars appear. Turbulence in the atmosphere, warm and cool pockets of air sliding past each other invisibly overhead, is what makes stars twinkle back home, their light bending and wavering slightly as it passes through shifting layers on its way down. Astronomers have a word for this wavering, and a great deal of their work anywhere else on the planet involves fighting against it, correcting for it, building instruments clever enough to smooth it back out again after the fact. Up here, with the air resting in long, calm layers rather than churning and mixing the way it does over warmer, wetter ground, that wavering settles down almost entirely. Stars don't so much twinkle as simply sit, holding steady in one place the way a lit window in a distant house holds steady across a quiet field at night, unmoving, unblinking, exactly where you left it a moment ago when you glanced away. It's this particular combination, dry air, thin air, and calm air, layered one on top of the other, that has made this plateau one of the quietest, clearest places left anywhere for looking outward. People who study the sky for a living, gathering light from objects so distant that the light itself set out on its journey long before anyone alive today was born, have built some of their most careful instruments directly onto this high ground, choosing it specifically because so little stands between their equipment and whatever they're trying to see. Walk near one of these observation sites after dark, and the domes housing the largest instruments sit closed and quiet through the earlier part of the evening, waiting for the air around them to settle into the same steadiness as everything else up here before anyone inside bothers opening them for the night's work. Once they finally do open, the mirrors and lenses inside spend the following hours turned patiently toward one small patch of sky after another, gathering whatever faint light happens to be arriving from that particular direction, sometimes light that left its source a stretch of time so long ago that trying to hold the number in your mind starts to feel almost the same as trying to hold sand that keeps slipping quietly through your fingers no matter how carefully you try to close your hand around it. Near one of these silent domes, the scale of the work becomes easier to appreciate about how little effort the sky itself seems to be making. It isn't performing for anyone. It isn't trying to be beautiful or impressive or worth the long drive most visitors take to get here. It's simply doing what it always does when nothing stands in its way, revealing exactly as much of itself as physics allows, indifferent to whether anyone happens to be lying underneath it with their head tipped back, watching. The observatories themselves, seen from a distance during the day, look almost modest against the scale of the plateau surrounding them. Pale domes scattered here and there across otherwise empty ground, easy to mistake for boulders until the sun catches their curved surfaces at just the right angle. Inside, engineers and researchers spend long hours calibrating instruments sensitive enough to register light from objects that offer up barely a whisper of brightness by the time it finally reaches this particular stretch of ground. Much of the actual work happens in daylight. Oddly enough, checking alignments, adjusting mirrors, preparing everything so carefully that once darkness finally arrives and the domes slide open, there's nothing left to do but watch and record and wait for whatever the sky happens to offer that particular night. Away from the observatories themselves, out on open ground, far from any artificial light at all, the effect only deepens. Without a single bulb glowing anywhere nearby, your eyes have time to properly adjust, opening themselves fully to whatever faint light happens to reach them, until details invisible under ordinary conditions start quietly appearing. Certain patches of that pale band across the sky resolve into individual clusters if you look carefully enough. Tiny knots of light within the larger smear, each one, if you could somehow travel close enough to see it properly, actually a crowded gathering of countless stars rather than a single point at all. Planets, easy to mistake for particularly steady stars at first glance, sit noticeably still while everything else appears to drift with the night's slow turning. A small but genuine clue, once you know to look for it, about which points of light are close neighbours and which are something considerably further away. Lying out here long enough, in silence this complete, it becomes strangely easy to lose track of how much time has actually passed. The stars themselves offer little help with that. They shift, slowly, across the sky as the night goes on, tracing the same wide arc they trace every clear night in this part of the world. But the movement is gradual enough that watching it directly tells you almost nothing useful about the hour. Without a clock nearby, a person could plausibly guess wrong by an hour in either direction and never notice the mistake until morning finally arrived to correct them. This particular quality, this thorough and complete darkness away from any settlement, has become almost as valuable to the people studying the sky here as the dryness itself. Light pollution, drifting up from any nearby town or city, can undo a surprising amount of what altitude and dry air otherwise provide, washing out the faintest and most distant objects long before they ever reach a waiting telescope. Because so much of the surrounding land holds so few people and so few lights, entire stretches of this plateau remain dark enough, night after night, that even the faintest smudges of light drifting in from galaxies far beyond our own can still be gathered and studied without much interference at all. There's a particular kind of humility that settles over most people who spend real time out here after dark, lying on ground this dry, under a sky revealing this much of itself. It has little to do with feeling small, exactly, though that feeling does eventually arrive too. It has more to do with simply understanding, in a way that's hard to fully grasp anywhere with a normal amount of haze and glow overhead, just how much sky has always been there, waiting quietly behind whatever moisture and light usually keeps it hidden everywhere else. Nothing about the universe changed to make this possible. The stars aren't any closer here than they are back wherever you happen to be lying right now. It's simply that, for once, almost nothing stands between you and them. Local guides who bring small groups out onto the plateau after dark often let the silence run longer than the conversation, content to sit near a low fire and let visitors work through their own reactions at their own pace, because talking too much tends to spoil whatever quiet realization is already unfolding on its own. Some visitors ask, eventually, how many stars are actually visible from a spot like this compared to somewhere back home. The honest answer is usually a good deal less interesting than the number itself, which is simply that nobody bothers counting anymore once they're actually lying here, the scale of it all sliding past whatever purpose counting might have served in the first place. As the night finally gives way to morning, the same plateau that revealed so much of the universe overhead begins to reveal what has been happening beneath it all along. The first light reaches across the desert, touching the ridges and empty basins one after another. Farther inland, the ground begins to change again, rising into a valley shaped not by rain or rivers, but by wind, salt, and the enormous patience of time. That is where the desert takes on an entirely different character. Pale, ash-grey stone rises on either side, folded into ridges and low hollows that catch the early sun at an angle sharp enough to throw deep shadows across half of everything in view, leaving the other half lit in a soft, bleached white that looks, from a short distance, almost like snow resting where snow could never actually survive. Walk into this valley, and the ground underfoot changes character almost immediately from the flat gravel basins found elsewhere across the desert. Here, it rises and falls in odd, sculpted shapes, some smooth and rounded, others sharp enough at the edges that brushing against them carelessly could easily draw blood. Thin ridges stand on their own like fins rising out of otherwise flat ground, worn down to knife-edge thinness in places, standing exactly as they've stood for a length of time that has nothing to do with any single storm or single season, and everything to do with wind that never really stopped working, one grain of loosened stone at a time, across a stretch of years too long to comfortably picture from a single visit. This is what people who study these shapes call wind erosion, though the term itself does little to capture what it actually feels like to stand among the results. Without rain here to soften edges the way it does almost everywhere else, and without rivers to carry loose material away and deposit it somewhere new, wind has been left, for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, as the only real force still working on this particular landscape at all. And wind, unlike water, doesn't dissolve or carve so much as it simply wears, grain scraping gently against grain, carried on currents strong enough to lift fine dust but rarely strong enough to move anything heavier very far at all. Picture a loose scattering of sand, caught by wind and driven repeatedly against a low ridge of softer stone. Each individual grain striking that stone does almost nothing on its own, a touch so light it barely registers as contact at all. But repeat that same light touch across enough grains, across enough gusts, across a stretch of time reaching back long before anyone thought to walk out here and take notice, and the softer stone begins, eventually, to give way in exactly the spots the wind keeps favouring, hollowing out shallow depressions here, smoothing sharp edges there, leaving the harder, more resistant stone standing proud in ridges and spires that the wind simply couldn't wear down at anywhere near the same pace. Over enough of these repeated years, this uneven wearing produces shapes that look, at certain angles and in certain light, almost too deliberate to have happened by accident. Rounded domes rising beside knife-thin ridges, smooth hollows carved into the base of taller formations, undercut just enough that the rock above seems to hang slightly beyond what gravity alone should reasonably allow. Nothing here was shaped with any particular outcome in mind. The wind wasn't sculpting toward any picture it held in advance. It was simply following the same pattern it always follows, favouring softer stone over harder stone, favouring exposed edges over sheltered hollows, and repeating that same simple preference for so long that the results eventually start to look, to anyone walking through them for the first time, almost like the work of some patient and deliberate hand. Locals gave this particular stretch of valley a name that has stuck for a long while now: calling it the Valley of the Moon. And standing inside it, especially once the light starts to lower and lengthen toward evening, the name makes a certain kind of sense that doesn't need much further explanation. The ground holds none of the softness most landscapes carry. No grass, no scattered brush, nothing at all breaking up the pale expanse of bare stone and salt-crusted soil stretching out in every direction. Shadows fall sharp and long here, in a way they rarely do anywhere with enough moisture in the air to soften their edges slightly, giving the whole valley, particularly right around sunset, a stark, high-contrast quality that feels closer to photographs of another world entirely than to anywhere most visitors have stood before. As the sun drops lower, the colours across this valley shift in a way that's worth simply watching rather than trying to describe too closely. Pale grey deepens first into something closer to rose, catching along the tops of the taller ridges while the hollows below them slip into shadow far earlier than the light overhead would suggest they should. Then, as the sun sinks further still, that rose deepens again, edging toward a deep orange along the highest points, before finally fading into a soft violet that spreads slowly across the whole valley floor as the last direct light finally gives out completely. Visitors who make the trip specifically to watch this happen tend to fall quiet somewhere partway through it without anyone particularly suggesting they should, the shifting light doing more to encourage silence than any request ever could. There's a particular formation deeper within this valley, a tall, narrow spire of stone standing apart from the ridges around it that locals have taken to calling the Three Marys, worn down by wind into three separate, rounded shapes rising from a single connected base. Nobody claims to know exactly how long wind alone took to carve these three shapes free from whatever single mass of stone they once belonged to, though estimates run into a stretch of time long enough that trying to picture it clearly becomes its own kind of quiet exercise, watching this formation catch the day's last light while trying, and mostly failing, to hold the true scale of its own patience, comfortably in mind. Not far from that same spire, the valley floor gives way to a wider, flatter stretch locals sometimes call the amphitheatre, ringed on nearly every side by low walls of stone rising, just high enough to block the sound of wind passing overhead, leaving the space inside strangely hushed compared to the open ground beyond it. Visitors who wander into the middle of this hollow often lower their voices without quite meaning to, the enclosed shape of the place, seeming to invite quiet the way a small chapel might, even though nothing here was built with any purpose in mind beyond the slow, accidental architecture of wind, finding the path of least resistance through softer stone over a stretch of time too long to properly attach. And number two, salt plays its own part in shaping this valley too, working alongside the wind rather than against it. Ancient deposits left behind long ago when a shallow body of water once rested somewhere in this same basin before drying away completely, still linger beneath much of the surface here, crystallizing near the top of the soil in thin white crusts that crunch faintly underfoot in certain patches. As temperatures shift sharply between day and night, this salt expands and contracts in tiny, repeated movements, working its own slow pressure against the surrounding stone from the inside, loosening flakes and fragments that the wind then carries away, adding one more patient hand to the same unhurried process of wearing everything here down towards something smoother, something simpler than whatever shape it held before. That temperature swing felt so plainly at ground level, shapes more of this valley than a passing visitor might first assume. Stone that spends its afternoon absorbing heat under direct, unfiltered sun gives that heat back quickly once evening arrives, contracting slightly as it cools, and the difference between its hottest and coldest hours, repeated night after night across a stretch of time longer than seems entirely fair to picture, opens tiny fractures along weaknesses already present in the rock. Nothing dramatic ever happens in any single night. A person could return to the same formation morning after morning for a full season and notice no visible change at all. But stretched out across the kind of time this valley has had available to it, that quiet daily contraction becomes its own patient contributor, working alongside the wind and the salt rather than separately from them. 3 slow hands shaping the same stone at 3 different paces, none of them ever in any particular hurry to finish. Stand in the middle of this valley at full dark, once the last of that violet light has finally faded completely, and the same sky we spent time under earlier in this journey reappears overhead, arching directly above ground, shaped entirely by wind and salt and time rather than by rain or river. It's a striking pairing, standing on ground this thoroughly emptied of water, looking up into a sky this thoroughly emptied of moisture as well, both shaped in their own separate ways by the exact same absence that has defined nearly everything we've encountered so far in this particular corner of the world. There is a quiet symmetry here. The same dryness that clears the sky above has also preserved the stone below. The same dryness that lets this sky reveal so much of itself after dark is the very same dryness that has let this valley's stone hold its sharp, unweathered shapes for so impossibly long. Nothing softens up here. Not the light arriving from distant stars, and not the rock resting quietly beneath them. Everything simply holds its shape, undisturbed, for as long as the desert continues offering it nothing at all to wear it down except the same patient, endless work of the wind. By full darkness, the sharp ridges have cooled beneath the crowded sky, and somewhere across the valley, a single grain of salt-crusted sand shifts almost imperceptibly in the passing air, joining the countless tiny movements that have shaped this landscape over time. Further south and east from that valley of wind-carved stone, the ground eventually gives way to something entirely different underfoot, a wide, pale expanse stretching out so far in every direction that the horizon seems to simply dissolve into it rather than meet it at any clear edge. White, or close enough to white that the mind wants to call it snow at first glance, even though the air here carries a heat that no snowfield could ever survive. This is salt, not scattered here and there the way it might rest along a coastline somewhere, but spread continuously across the basin floor in a hardened crust thick enough, in places, to walk across without leaving much of a mark at all. Kneel down and touch this ground and it feels almost nothing like the fine, dry dust found elsewhere across the desert. It's firmer, cooler, oddly, even under direct sun, and textured in small raised ridges and hexagonal cracks that repeat themselves across the surface with a regularity that looks, from a short distance, almost too even to have happened without some deliberate hand arranging it. Nothing arranged it, though, beyond water and time working together in a rhythm this basin has repeated more times than anyone could easily count. To understand how ground this dry ended up covered in a mineral usually associated with oceans, you have to imagine this same basin at some point in its distant past holding something it doesn't hold anymore. Long before the current arrangement of ocean, current and mountain wall settled fully into place, this same low stretch of ground occasionally held shallow water, gathered here after storms further inland sent runoff pooling down into whatever depression happened to sit lowest across the surrounding landscape. That water carried with it whatever minerals it had picked up along its journey, dissolved and invisible, present only as an unnoticed trace within each drop. And once that water arrived here, in a basin with nowhere further to drain, and a sun strong enough to pull moisture back up into the air faster than any new rain could replace it, the water itself eventually disappeared entirely, evaporating back into a sky that, even then, was already inclined to keep whatever it took for itself. What that water left behind, once it was gone, was everything it had been carrying that couldn't evaporate along with it. Salt and other minerals besides, settling out of the retreating water and resting quietly on the basin floor exactly where the last of the moisture disappeared. A single evaporation like this leaves behind a layer too thin to notice underfoot, barely a dusting. But repeat that same cycle across enough seasons, enough centuries, enough of whatever stretch of time this basin has actually had available to it, and those thin layers begin to accumulate into something with real thickness and real weight. Crust building on crust, each one a quiet record of some shallow pool that gathered here once, held itself together for a while, and eventually gave everything it carried back to the ground before disappearing completely. Walk further into the flat itself, and certain patches reveal small, dark pools resting just beneath the crust's surface. Water still lingering here even now, too salty and too mineral heavy for the sun to fully finish it off the way it finishes off ordinary rainwater elsewhere. These pools hold a strange kind of stillness, their surfaces catching the sky above them with a clarity that seems almost too perfect, undisturbed by any current or breeze strong enough to ripple them. Dip a hand in, carefully, and the water feels different immediately, heavier somehow, thick with dissolved mineral in a concentration far beyond anything an ordinary lake or river would ever hold. It's within these particular pools, and within the mineral-rich brine soaking through the ground beneath them, that one of this basin's quieter modern stories has taken shape. Lithium, a light, soft metal dissolved invisibly through much of this brine, has become valuable enough in recent years that certain companies now draw this same salty water up through wells and canals, spreading it out across shallow, human-made ponds where the same relentless sun that once evaporated ancient lakes now does the same patient work on a smaller, more deliberate scale, concentrating the lithium left behind until it can finally be gathered and carried away. Seen from above, these evaporation ponds stretch out in long, rectangular blocks of pale turquoise and green, oddly vivid colours against the surrounding white and tan, a small, engineered echo of the same basic process that built this entire flat in the first place, simply guided now by human hands rather than by chance alone. There's something worth sitting with in that quiet continuity. A process this basin has been repeating on its own terms for longer than anyone could properly count, now being borrowed and sped up in one small corner of it. Water still giving up whatever it carries once the sun finally finishes with it, exactly the way it always has, just noticed now and put to use in a way it never was before. Beyond the ponds, though, the flat continues on largely unchanged from however it must have looked long before anyone thought to draw a single well into it. Walk out far enough, and the white crust beneath your feet begins to feel less like ground and more like something suspended, flat and pale in every direction. The mountains ringing this basin sitting distant enough that they seem to hover rather than rise, their usual solidity softened by heat, shimmer and distance into something closer to a painted backdrop than an actual wall of stone. On certain still mornings, before that shimmer has fully settled in, the surface holds enough moisture, left over from whatever brine sits closest to the surface, that it reflects the sky above it almost perfectly, mountains and clouds repeating themselves in a mirror stretched flat across the ground, blurring, for a disorienting moment, any clear sense of where the world ends and its reflection begins. Birds pass through here occasionally, following routes that have very little to do with anything this basin currently offers, and everything to do with habits carried forward from a time when shallow water actually did gather here reliably each season, rather than only in memory and mineral crust. Flocks of pale pink birds, long-legged and long-necked, sometimes rest at the edges of the larger remaining pools, filtering whatever small, salt-tolerant creatures manage to survive in water this concentrated. Their presence here a strange and quiet reminder that even ground this thoroughly given over to salt still holds, in certain corners, just enough life to draw something in from outside it. At night, this flat takes on its own particular kind of stillness, distinct even from the stillness found elsewhere across this desert. Heat that gathered across the white crust all day releases quickly once the sun goes down, the pale ground losing its warmth even faster than the darker gravel and stone found elsewhere across the interior, since white surfaces hold on to far less of the sun's heat to begin with. By full dark, the flat can feel almost startlingly cold compared to how it felt only hours before, the crust underfoot settling into a kind of hard, brittle chill that seems to match the crowded, precise stars now sitting directly overhead, both ground and sky, in their own separate ways, offering up exactly what they've been holding on to, with nothing left over to soften the transition between one and the other. There's a particular kind of patience embedded in a landscape like this one, worth carrying forward as this journey continues. Every layer of salt underfoot represents a lake that no longer exists, a pool that gathered, held itself together for a while, and eventually gave everything it carried back to the sky. The flat itself is really a kind of quiet archive, each thin crust a record of some ancient, temporary body of water that most people walking across it today would never even think to imagine standing there, evaporated so completely and for so long now that only its mineral leftovers remain to prove it was ever there at all. And it's precisely in ground this concentrated with salt, this thoroughly emptied of ordinary fresh water, that this particular desert story takes its most surprising turn yet. Because even here, in brine too heavy and too mineral-laden for almost anything to tolerate, something has found a way to keep quietly living anyway. For now, let this white flat settle into its own particular quiet, the way it settles every night once the heat of the day has finally drained away completely. Somewhere out there, a shallow pool holds its reflection of the sky steady and undisturbed, salt crystallizing slowly along its edges the same patient way it always has, one thin layer added to everything that came before it, with no particular hurry to finish. It seems almost reasonable, standing on ground this dry, this salted, this thoroughly abandoned by ordinary rainfall, to assume that nothing at all could possibly be living here. And across huge stretches of this desert's driest core, that assumption holds up perfectly well. Certain patches of ground really do appear to be, as far as anyone has been able to detect, entirely without life of any kind, no matter how carefully researchers have looked. But entirely is a large word, and this desert, patient as it is with almost everything else, has left just enough small openings, in just enough unlikely corners for something to slip through anyway. Bring a magnifying lens to a patch of ordinary-looking salt crust out on the flat, and at first there's nothing to see beyond crystal and mineral stain, exactly what you'd expect. But look more carefully. In certain spots where a little more moisture happens to linger just beneath the surface, and faint traces of colour sometimes reveal themselves along the edges of individual salt crystals, thin films of green or reddish tint clinging to structures too small to properly resolve without real magnification. These are colonies of microorganisms, built from bacteria and simple algae that have found a way to survive tucked inside the salt itself, drawing whatever faint moisture and light manage to reach them through gaps and pores in the crystal structure surrounding them. It's a strange kind of shelter, living inside salt rather than simply near it. The same crystals that make this ground so inhospitable to nearly everything else also happen to trap tiny pockets of moisture within their structure, protecting whatever manages to settle inside from the worst of the surface heat and the harshest direct sunlight beating down from above. These small colonies aren't thriving, exactly, in any sense that would look impressive under ordinary conditions. They're surviving, patiently, in numbers, and at a pace slow enough that an entire human lifetime might pass without any dramatic change in a colony this size, tucked into salt, this concentrated, in a corner of the world, this thoroughly emptied of everything most living things typically require. Move away from the salt flats themselves, back toward the higher, drier gravel plains further inland, and life becomes even harder to find, though not, as it turns out, entirely absent even there. Certain rocks scattered across these plains, examined closely enough, reveal a faint discoloration just beneath their outer surface, a thin band of color sitting a few careful millimeters below the exposed face of the stone, invisible unless you happen to break the rock open or catch it at exactly the right angle in low, raking light. This is where some of the hardiest life in this entire desert has chosen to settle. Not on the surface of the rock at all, but just beneath it, in a thin layer where enough light can still filter through to allow the basic chemistry of photosynthesis to continue, while the rock itself provides just enough shelter from direct sun and drying wind to keep whatever moisture happens to exist trapped close. Enough to be useful. Communities of bacteria and simple fungi live out their entire existence in this narrow band, a fraction of an inch thick, tucked inside stone rather than resting openly upon it, patient in a way that makes even the salt crust colonies out on the flat look almost exposed by comparison. Researchers who study these particular communities describe them as living at the very edge of what's considered survivable anywhere on this planet, a boundary condition rather than a comfortable niche, existing not because conditions here are good in any ordinary sense, but because they happen to be by the narrowest possible margin, not quite bad enough to make survival completely impossible. It's a distinction worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Thriving and merely surviving are different things entirely, and almost everything managing to hang on in this particular corner of the desert belongs firmly to the second category, existing in the barest possible margin between what life actually requires and what this landscape is willing to offer. And yet, in occasional pockets, scattered here and there across the higher plains, something a little more visible manages to hold on as well. Certain hardy shrubs, low and grey-green, spread their roots wide rather than deep, spreading out just beneath the surface to catch whatever faint trace of moisture happens to gather there after the rare event, some years apart, when a little more dampness than usual finds its way down from higher ground. These plants grow with an almost unbearable slowness, adding only a small amount of new growth across an entire season, storing whatever moisture they do manage to gather carefully within thickened stems and waxy, water-conserving leaves designed to lose as little as possible back into the dry air surrounding them. Some of the oldest of these shrubs, examined by researchers curious about exactly how long a single plant might survive under conditions this unforgiving, have turned out to be considerably older than anyone initially expected. Their slow, careful growth stretching back across a length of time that would put many trees found in more forgiving climates to shame. A plant here doesn't grow quickly because it doesn't need to compete with anything nearby for light or space, the way plants crowded together in a healthier ecosystem eventually must. It simply grows exactly as fast as its circumstances allow, and its circumstances in this particular corner of the world allow for very little at all, stretched out patiently across a stretch of time that most living things elsewhere would never get the chance to experience. Higher still, up near the very edge of where the desert finally starts giving way to the base of the mountains, a different kind of resilience shows up entirely, this time in small, quick movements rather than anything rooted or still. Certain lizards, adapted specifically to this particular stretch of ground, spend much of the hottest part of the day buried just beneath the surface, emerging only during the cooler hours near dawn and dusk, when the air briefly settles into a temperature their bodies can actually tolerate being exposed to. Insects, too, have found their own narrow windows of activity, appearing briefly after whatever rare dampness happens to reach the ground, completing entire life cycles in the short span before that dampness disappears again, leaving behind eggs or dormant forms capable of waiting patiently for however long it takes before the next brief opportunity finally arrives. There's a particular quality shared by nearly every living thing that has found a way to persist in this desert, whether bacteria tucked inside salt crystals, fungi hiding just beneath a rock's outer surface, or a shrub adding its slow, careful growth one season at a time. None of them are fighting against the dryness, exactly the way that word might suggest some ongoing struggle or contest. They've simply arranged their entire existence around it, shaping every part of their behavior and biology to fit precisely into whatever narrow openings this landscape happens to offer, however brief or however small those openings might be. It's worth pausing here on what this actually says about life more broadly, without turning the thought into anything larger than it needs to be. Almost everywhere else on this planet, life crowds in wherever conditions allow even the smallest margin of comfort, competing, multiplying, spreading as quickly as circumstances permit. Here, in this particular corner of the world, that same fundamental persistence still shows up, but stripped down to something far quieter, far slower, far more deliberate. Survival here doesn't look like abundance. It looks like patience, stretched out across a stretch of time that would exhaust almost anything trying to rush through it. Come the coolest, dampest hours just before dawn, certain slopes facing the ocean receive a little more than the rest of this desert ever does, catching the faint trailing edge of fog that occasionally drifts far enough inland to leave behind a fine mist before the day's heat burns it away completely. It's here, on these particular slopes, that this desert story is about to take one more unexpected turn, because in these few specific places, dampened just enough and just often enough by fog rather than by rain, something has managed not merely to survive, but to actually flourish, if only for the briefest and most infrequent stretches of time. And somewhere beyond these quiet, hidden forms of life, where the desert slopes begin to lean toward the distant ocean, the air carries something the interior almost never receives, a little moisture, arriving silently through the fog before the warmth of morning takes it away again. The desert becomes softer there, if only for a few quiet hours. Most years, out across the gravel plains toward the desert's southern edge, nothing happens at all worth mentioning. The ground holds its usual pale brown, unbroken by anything green, stretching toward the horizon in the same flat, undisturbed silence found across so much of this desert already. A visitor passing through in an ordinary year would have no reason to suspect that this particular stretch of ground was capable of anything except exactly what it appears to be. And then, every so often, spaced apart by gaps of years rather than seasons, something entirely different happens instead. It begins with rain, though rain arriving in an amount that would barely register as noticeable almost anywhere else on the planet. A handful of storms, carried in from somewhere out over the ocean by a shift in weather patterns that only rarely favors this particular stretch of coastline, drop just enough water onto ground that has been waiting, in a manner of speaking, for exactly this. Not waiting consciously, of course. Nothing here is capable of that kind of anticipation, but waiting in the sense that something has been resting quietly beneath the surface this entire time, prepared for a moment that might not arrive for years, and sometimes doesn't arrive for the better part of a decade. Within days of that rain finally soaking into the ground, the desert floor begins to change in a way that looks, to anyone who has only ever seen this landscape dry, almost impossible to reconcile with everything they thought they understood about it. Small green shoots push up through gravel that seemed only a week earlier to be as barren as anywhere else in this desert's driest stretches. Then, faster than seems reasonable given how little rain actually fell, those shoots begin to flower, and within a matter of weeks, huge stretches of ground that had shown no sign of life at all are suddenly covered edge to edge in colour, purples and pinks and yellows spreading across the gravel in wide, uneven sheets that ripple gently whenever a breath of wind passes over them. This event has its own name here, one that translates simply enough into something like the flowering desert, and it captures, about as well as any short phrase could, exactly what it feels like to witness. A landscape that spent years, sometimes the better part of a decade, offering nothing but bare ground and pale stone suddenly transforms, over the course of only a few weeks, into something that looks almost unrelated to the desert surrounding it on every side. An island of impossible colour resting inside a much larger sea of ordinary dust and gravel. To understand how this happens at all, you have to go back to the seeds themselves and to a particular kind of patience that makes even the slowest growing shrub we passed earlier in this journey seem hurried. Buried in the soil across these gravel plains, scattered thin and invisible beneath the surface, rest countless seeds left behind by the last flowering event, and the one before that, and the one before that again, stretching back across a length of time that would be difficult to properly calculate even with careful research. These seeds don't simply sit there passively, the way a seed forgotten in a drawer might sit for a few seasons before eventually losing its ability to grow at all. They've developed something closer to genuine dormancy, an ability to remain fully viable, fully capable of eventually sprouting across gaps of time that would kill an ordinary seed within a single dry season. Part of this comes down to a protective coating many of these seeds carry, tough enough to resist the kind of moisture loss that would otherwise slowly degrade whatever fragile potential for growth sits waiting inside. Part of it comes down to a built-in chemical signal within the seed itself, something that actively suppresses germination until conditions arrive that genuinely justify the risk of finally sprouting, rather than allowing the seed to respond to any brief, insufficient dampness that might tempt it prematurely, only to leave whatever fragile shoot emerged stranded and doomed the moment that thin trace of moisture disappeared again. This matters more than it might first seem, because germinating at the wrong moment, in a landscape this unforgiving, would waste an opportunity that might not come again for years. A seed that sprouts after a light, passing dampness, rather than a genuine soaking rain, spends its one chance at growth on a gamble almost certain to fail, withering within days once whatever thin moisture triggered it inevitably runs out. The seeds that have survived, generation after generation, in ground this difficult, are the ones whose internal signal happened to be cautious enough, patient enough, to wait specifically for the kind of rainfall that actually offers a genuine chance at completing an entire life cycle from seed to flower to a fresh scattering of seeds again. Once that genuine rainfall does finally arrive, though everything changes with a speed that seems to contradict everything this desert has taught us so far about patience and slowness. These particular plants, adapted specifically to a landscape where rare moisture might disappear again within only a few weeks, have evolved a growth cycle compressed down into something remarkably brief, racing from germination through flowering through seed production in a fraction of the time an ordinary plant, growing somewhere with more reliable rainfall, would ever need to accomplish the same. Sequence. There's no leisure in this growth at all. None of the careful, unhurried pace we saw earlier in the desert's oldest surviving shrubs. This is urgency, compressed as tightly as biology allows, every available resource poured immediately into growing, flowering, and setting seed before the brief window of moisture inevitably closes again. Walk out across one of these blooming stretches while it's actually happening, and the scale of it becomes difficult to take in all at once. Purple stretches indents, low carpets across some sections, individual flowers small, but packed close enough together that from a short distance the ground itself appears to have simply changed colour. Elsewhere, taller stems rise a little higher, topped with pale yellow blossoms that nod gently whenever wind moves through, catching the light in a way that makes the whole surrounding area seem to shimmer faintly, even without any breeze at all. Bees and other insects, appearing from wherever they've been quietly surviving the intervening dry years, move busily between these blossoms in numbers that seem entirely out of proportion to how empty this same ground looked only weeks before, drawn in by a resource that, for them too, arrives only rarely and must be used as fully and as quickly as possible while it lasts. Some of these insects, researchers have found, spend the long dry years between blooms in their own version of dormancy, tucked away underground or inside whatever narrow shelter a rock crevice happens to offer, emerging only once the surrounding scent of flowering plants signals that the brief working season has finally arrived. Their entire visible lifespan, from emergence through pollination through whatever comes next, can be compressed into a period barely longer than the bloom itself. A life lived almost entirely within the narrow window this desert happens to make available, and spent almost entirely in hibernation the rest of the time, waiting alongside the very seeds they'll eventually help pollinate once conditions. Finally, a line again. There's something worth sitting with, standing in the middle of one of these blooming fields, about how thoroughly this desert can contradict its own usual character without actually breaking any of the rules that define it the rest of the time. Nothing about this flowering event violates the basic dryness that shapes everything else we've explored on this journey. It's simply the dryness pausing, briefly, exactly long enough for whatever has been patiently waiting underground to finally get its turn. And that pause never lasts especially long. Within a matter of weeks, sometimes only a month or two after the first shoots originally appeared, the flowers begin fading again, seed pods forming and drying, and eventually scattering their contents back into the same gravel the parent plants first emerged from, restocking the ground with a fresh supply of dormant seeds ready to wait out whatever stretch of ordinary dryness comes next, however many years that stretch happens to last. The green fades. The colour drains slowly back out of the landscape, and within a season, sometimes less, the ground returns to looking exactly the way it always looks the rest of the time, bare and pale and apparently lifeless, holding its secret quietly beneath the surface again, waiting for a rain that might not return again for years. There's a particular kind of faith embedded in a cycle like this one. Though faith isn't quite the right word for something that operates entirely on biology and chemistry rather than any conscious hope. Still, it's difficult not to feel a version of that word anyway, standing on ground that spends the overwhelming majority of its existence in complete silence and complete stillness, and yet holds, the entire time, everything it needs to erupt into colour the moment conditions finally allow it. Nothing about the dormant seed changes while it waits. It simply persists, unchanged, for however long persistence happens to be required, depending on nothing except the quiet, patient logic written into its own structure. Researchers who study this particular phenomenon have found that the trigger behind it reaches back well beyond this stretch of coastline itself, tied to a much larger pattern of ocean warming that occurs every so often far out across the Pacific, shifting weather systems across an enormous stretch of the globe and occasionally sending just enough moisture drifting toward this otherwise rain-starved coast to finally satisfy whatever threshold these dormant seeds have been quietly waiting to cross. It's a strange kind of connection to sit with, a warming current somewhere out past the horizon, invisible and distant, eventually translating, months later, into fields of purple and yellow spreading across ground that spends nearly every other year in complete silence. Nothing about this desert exists in true isolation, however much its stillness might suggest otherwise. Even here, in ground this dry, the wider rhythms of the ocean and the atmosphere eventually make themselves known, arriving late and rarely, but arriving all the same. For now, let this fading bloom settle back into stillness the way it always eventually does, colour draining slowly out of ground that will, within a season, look exactly as bare and as quiet as everywhere else across this same stretch of desert. Somewhere beneath that returning quiet, a fresh scattering of seeds is already settling into the gravel, patient and unhurried, prepared to wait however many years it takes before the next rare storm finally gives them their turn. Along certain slopes facing directly toward the ocean, where the land rises just high enough to catch what drifts in from the water below, mornings unfold in a way quite different from almost anywhere else across this desert. Long before sunrise properly arrives, a thick, pale bank of fog begins rolling in off the sea, climbing the lower slopes in slow, unhurried waves, wrapping around whatever rock and low vegetation happens to sit in its path, coating everything it touches in a fine, cool dampness that feels, after so much dry ground elsewhere, almost like stepping into an entirely different climate altogether. We touched briefly, earlier in this journey, on the particular current running along this coastline, cold enough to suppress the kind of evaporation that would otherwise feed ordinary rain clouds, producing fog instead of rainfall across the stretch of coast closest to the water. What we haven't yet followed closely is what happens once that fog actually arrives inland, climbing these particular slopes, and what has managed, over a very long stretch of time, to make a genuine home out of something that never quite commits to being rain at all. These slopes carry their own name here, one that refers to the fog oases scattered along certain elevations of this coastal range, patches of surprising green clinging to hillsides that, only a short distance further inland or further downhill, return to the same bare, colourless ground found across the rest of the desert. Approaching one of these patches from below, the change announces itself gradually rather than all at once, scattered lichen first, pale and crusted, clinging low against exposed rock in patches too faint to notice unless you're looking closely. Climb a little higher, into the thickest part of the fog bank's usual reach, and that scattered lichen gives way to something considerably more substantial, entire slopes draped in thick, hanging growths that sway gently whenever the fog itself stirs, catching moisture directly from the passing air rather than from any rain that might, or might not, eventually fall. This particular way of gathering water deserves a slower look, because it runs against nearly everything most living things elsewhere depend on to survive. Rather than drawing moisture up through roots buried in wet soil, the way almost every plant most people have ever grown or tended does, these lichens and mosses draw their water directly from the fog itself, absorbing tiny droplets straight through their surface as the mist drifts past and settles briefly against them. It's an efficient trick in its own quiet way, skipping the ground almost entirely and pulling moisture straight from the air passing through, exactly the resource this desert offers most reliably, even in places where actual rainfall essentially never arrives at all. Stand inside one of these fog oases while the mist is still thick and heavy, usually in the earliest hours of the morning before the sun has had time to properly climb, and the air itself feels almost tangible in a way it rarely does elsewhere across this desert. Droplets collect slowly on every exposed surface, beading along blades of grass, gathering into thicker drops that eventually grow heavy enough to fall, one at a time, onto the ground below, a soft, irregular patter that stands in for rain in a place that otherwise almost never receives any. This dripping, modest as it sounds compared to a real storm, is often enough, given time, to actually soak the ground beneath these particular patches of vegetation, feeding shallow roots that couldn't survive on the fog alone but manage perfectly well on whatever moisture the fog eventually surrenders to gravity. Local communities living near these slopes discovered, a while back, that this same fog could be captured more directly, without needing to wait for it to first pass through a hillside full of lichen before finally releasing its moisture. Simple mesh screens, stretched vertically across slopes that catch the thickest part of the daily fog bank, work in essentially the same manner as the lichen itself, gathering droplets out of the passing mist and letting them run down into collection troughs positioned along the bottom edge. A single screen, modest in size, can gather a meaningful amount of usable water across the course of a single foggy morning. Water that requires no well, no pipeline stretching back toward the mountains, nothing beyond a length of fine mesh positioned in exactly the right spot to intercept moisture that would otherwise simply drift past and evaporate somewhere further inland once the day's heat finally burned it away. There's a particular elegance in a solution this simple, borrowed almost directly from whatever the lichen figured out on its own a very long time before anyone thought to build a mesh screen in imitation of it. Neither the lichen nor the screen creates any new water at all. They simply intercept something already present in the passing air, catching it before it continues on its way to nowhere in particular, the same basic principle at work whether the collecting surface happens to be a thread of fungal tissue or a length of woven plastic mesh strung between two wooden posts. Some communities have relied on these fog screens for a very long time now, watering small vegetable plots that could never otherwise survive on ground receiving no real rainfall at all, coaxing a modest but genuine harvest out of nothing more than mist and mesh and patience. There's something quietly satisfying in watching a system built this simply do exactly what it was designed to do, morning after morning, requiring nothing beyond its own presence in the fog's path. No pump, no motor, no ongoing maintenance beyond the occasional repair of wherever wind or weather happened to loosen a fitting. Walk higher still, up toward the thickest and most reliably foggy stretch of these slopes, and certain trees appear as well, gnarled and low, their canopies flattened and shaped by the same persistent, moisture-laden wind that feeds the lichen further downhill. These trees represent something considerably older than the lichen surrounding them. Forests that once covered far more of this coastal range than survives today, thinning gradually over a long stretch of time as the fog patterns shifting slightly here and there left certain slopes drier than they once were, stranding isolated patches of forest on whatever hillsides still happened to catch enough moisture to sustain them. Beneath the canopy of one of these fog forests, the ground feels different from almost anywhere else in this entire desert, soft in places with a thin layer of actual leaf litter, damp enough in the early morning that stepping carefully becomes second nature, out of habit developed everywhere else across drier ground that no longer applies here at all. Insects move through this understory in numbers that would seem entirely ordinary almost anywhere else on the planet, but that feel almost startling this close to a desert this famously empty of nearly everything else. Birds nest in these same trees, drawn by an abundance of insects and shelter that exists nowhere else within a considerable distance in any direction. It's a strange kind of neighbouring, once again, standing beneath damp branches in a small forest sustained entirely by fog, knowing that only a short walk in nearly any direction leads back to ground as dry and as silent as anywhere else across this same stretch of coastline. These fog oases exist as small, isolated pockets, islands of genuine green surrounded by an ocean of dust, each one entirely dependent on a specific elevation, a specific angle toward the coast, a specific relationship with the daily fog bank that shift even slightly, and the whole fragile arrangement would likely wither and fail within a single dry season. Researchers studying these particular patches of forest describe them as living records of a wetter climate that once extended much further across this coastal range than it does now. Holdouts clinging to precisely the narrow elevation band where fog still arrives reliably enough and thickly enough to sustain something more than lichen and scattered moss. As the broader climate here has shifted, slowly, over a stretch of time reaching back well before anyone thought to study it carefully, that reliable elevation band has itself shifted too, sometimes narrowing, sometimes climbing higher up the slope as conditions below grow drier still. What survives at any given moment simply reflects whatever narrow strip of hillside currently receives enough fog to make survival possible, a moving target the surviving forest has had no real choice except to track as faithfully as an unmoving root system possibly allows. There's a particular sound found only within these fog forests, distinct from silence found everywhere else across this desert, a soft, steady dripping from countless separate points across the canopy above, droplets collecting on leaf after leaf until each one finally grows heavy enough to fall, landing somewhere below in a rhythm too irregular to properly call a rhythm at all, closer to a gentle scattering of individual sounds arriving from every direction at once, none of them loud, none of them urgent, simply continuing for as long as the fog itself continues to linger against the branches feeding it. Small mammals move through this understory too, rarely seen but occasionally heard, rustling through leaf litter that exists nowhere else within a considerable distance in any direction. Foxes pass through some of these fog forests on nightly rounds, drawn by the same abundance of insects and small prey that the birds themselves depend on, their presence here entirely dependent on this narrow strip of reliably damp hillside continuing to receive its fog exactly as it always has. Remove the fog, even briefly, even for a single unusually dry season, and this entire small food chain would begin to unravel from the bottom up, the lichen drying first, the insects following soon after, and eventually the birds and foxes finding themselves forced to search elsewhere for whatever this hillside can no longer reliably provide. By mid-morning, once the sun has finally climbed high enough to burn away the last of the lingering mist, these same slopes dry out considerably, the dripping slowing and then stopping entirely, the whole forest settling into a quieter, warmer stillness that will hold until the following morning's fog eventually arrives to repeat the entire process again. It's a daily cycle distinct from almost everything else we've explored across this desert so far, most of which unfolds across years or centuries rather than across the simple span of a single morning. Here, at least, in this narrow band of hillside, something resembling ordinary weather actually happens, arriving and departing within the space of a few hours, offering a small, temporary abundance that the rest of this desert almost never gets to experience at all. There's something worth carrying forward from these fog-fed slopes as this journey eventually starts making its way back toward wherever it began. Even in a desert built almost entirely around absence, around the near-total lack of anything falling from the sky, life has still managed to find whatever narrow opening happened to remain available, whether that opening came in the form of a rare storm arriving once every several years, or a daily fog bank arriving reliably enough on the right slope at the right elevation to sustain an entire, small forest indefinitely. Neither solution required very much from the desert at all. Both simply required patience and a willingness to wait for exactly the right conditions before finally taking whatever small advantage those conditions happen to offer. For now, Let the soft dripping of this fog forest settle into quiet the way it does every single mid-morning, moisture drying slowly from leaves that will, by tomorrow's dawn, be damp again exactly as they always are. This particular patch of hillside continuing its own small, private cycle, regardless of whatever else happens to be occurring across the rest of this vast, dry stretch of coastline surrounding it on every side. Pull back now, gently, the way a slow exhale eventually settles into nothing at all, and let the whole of this desert come into view at once, rather than one particular stretch of it at a time. From high enough above, none of the separate places we've moved through tonight look quite as distinct from each other as they felt while actually standing inside them. The fog forests clinging to their narrow band of coastal hillside, the salt flats spreading their pale crust across the basin floor, the wind-carved valley, the high gravel plains, the plateau where the sky reveals itself so completely after dark. From this height, they blur together into a single long, pale stretch of coastline, curling gently alongside an ocean that never stops moving, backed by a wall of mountains that never stops climbing. The entire arrangement settled into a shape that has held, with only the slowest and most gradual of adjustments, for a length of time that makes every human structure and every human memory feel, by comparison, almost weightless. Rising higher still, in your mind, the coastline itself begins to shrink against the wider shape of the whole continent surrounding it, this narrow strip of dryness pressed thin along one edge of a much larger landmass, most of which carries entirely different weather, entirely different rainfall, entirely different rhythms of growth and decay playing out across it every single day. And yet this one particular strip continues much as it always has, largely untouched by the abundance unfolding only a short distance away on the far side of the same mountains that keep this coastline so thoroughly closed off from it. From higher still, the whole visible curve of the coastline starts to feel less like a place and more like a line, drawn carefully along the boundary between two enormous, patient forces that have been quietly negotiating the exact same terms for longer than either could properly measure on its own. Ocean on one side, offering almost nothing. Mountains on the other, taking almost everything that approaches from the opposite direction. And in between, this same narrow strip of ground, existing precisely because too much larger things elsewhere agreed, without ever needing to discuss it, on exactly how much moisture the space between them would be allowed to hold. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes from holding a view this wide in your mind, even without physically rising anywhere at all. Lying here now, picture the whole shape of it. A narrow strip of dry ground, squeezed between water too cold to offer much moisture and rock too high to let any moisture through, existing in that squeeze for a stretch of time reaching back long before anyone thought to give it a name at all. Everything we pass through tonight belongs, in the end, to that same single squeeze. The salt crusting the basin floor is simply water that once arrived here and then had nowhere left to go except upward, back into a sky that kept it for itself. The wind-carved ridges of pale stone are simply ground that never had rain arrive often enough to soften them, left instead to the much slower and much gentler hand of moving air. The lichen clinging to fog-fed slopes, and the small, dormant seeds waiting years underground for one brief storm are simply life, finding whatever narrow opening this same squeeze happened to leave available, however small, however rare, however far apart in time those openings happen to fall. None of it fights against the dryness, in the end. All of it has simply learned to fit inside it. There's something almost restful in seeing it this way, all at once, rather than piece by piece the way we followed it earlier tonight. A landscape doesn't need abundance to hold together as a whole. It doesn't need rivers, or forests stretching to the horizon, or rainfall arriving reliably each season to still make a kind of complete and coherent sense on its own terms. This desert makes sense precisely because everything within it, the salt, the wind-carved stone, The fog-fed lichen, the dormant seed, has arranged itself around the same single fact, patiently, without needing anything more than what that fact actually allows. Consider, resting here, how differently each part of this landscape experiences the passage of time, even though all of them exist within the very same stretch of dry coastline. Salt accumulates in a rhythm measured by evaporation, one thin layer added each time a shallow pool finally gives up the last of its water to the sky above it. Wind-carved stone changes on a rhythm measured by grains, each one lifted and carried and eventually deposited somewhere else, so gradually that no single visit could ever catch the difference. A dormant seed experiences almost no time at all while waiting, suspended in a kind of quiet pause that only truly resumes once rain finally arrives to end it. And the fog forest, alone among everything else we've passed through tonight, keeps its own daily rhythm, dampening and drying in a cycle so much faster than everything surrounding it that it seems to belong to an entirely different kind of place altogether. And yet all of these different rhythms rest, quietly, side by side, within the very same narrow strip of coastline, each one running at its own particular pace, none of them needing to match any of the others in order to keep functioning exactly as it always has. There's something worth carrying out of a place like this, though calling it a lesson might be too heavy for something this simple. Patience doesn't require a single, uniform pace to actually work. A seed can wait for years while, only a short distance away, fog drips from a leaf every single morning without fail. A salt crust can take centuries to thicken while wind, working at its own separate speed, finishes carving an entire ridge of stone into something delicate and thin. Nothing here needed to agree on how quickly to move. Each process simply continued at whatever pace its own particular nature required, indifferent to everything happening around it at a faster or slower rate. Picture, one more time before we finish, that single grain of sand we began with so many hours ago now, resting exactly where we first imagined it, somewhere out across this same stretch of coastline. It hasn't moved. Nothing has disturbed it. It has simply continued exactly as it was, holding its shape the way everything in this particular corner of the world tends to hold its shape, patiently, without needing anyone to notice or account for any of it. Think back, gently, over everything that single grain has quietly witnessed simply by resting where it happened to land. The mountains rising to the east, catching every storm before it could ever reach this far. The cold current offshore, keeping the ocean's moisture locked away rather than lifted into cloud. The centuries of silence that followed, ground going undisturbed for so long that its own history stopped being countable in any ordinary way. The reddish soil nearby, chosen once by people preparing to search another planet entirely for the faintest whisper of water. The stars overhead, arriving clear and steady on a night with nothing left in the air to blur them. The pale, wind-carved ridges rising not far from where this grain happens to rest, shaped by nothing more than moving air and an unhurried stretch of centuries. The salt, spreading its crust across a distant basin floor, each layer a quiet record of some shallow pool that gathered and waited and eventually gave everything back to the sky. The lichen clinging patiently to fog-fed slopes, drinking directly from passing mist rather than waiting for rain that almost never arrives. And the dormant seed, resting somewhere out on the gravel plains this very moment, prepared to wait however many years it takes before the next rare storm finally gives it permission to bloom. That single grain belongs to the same story as the reddish soil tested by instruments built for another planet entirely, the same story as the crystalline salt spreading across the basin floor, the same story as the wind-carved ridge standing pale and sharp against a sky that reveals more stars than most people ever get the chance to see. It belongs, too, to the same story as the small, dormant seed still waiting somewhere out on the gravel plains, and to the lichen still catching its morning fog on a distant hillside, and to the shallow brine pool still holding its reflection of the sky as steadily as it did the night we first passed by it. Every one of these things, however different they might have felt while we moved through them one at a time, are simply this same single squeeze played out across salt and stone and root and starlight and time. There's a particular comfort in remembering now that none of what we passed through tonight was ever waiting for us specifically. The stars overhead didn't arrange themselves for anyone lying here listening. The salt didn't crystallize with any audience in mind. The seed underground isn't hoping anyone notices when it finally blooms. Everything in this desert simply continues, the way it always has, entirely independent of whether anyone happens to be paying attention. And there's something quietly settling in that thought rather than something lonely. You don't need to hold any of this up. You don't need to remember every detail or carry any part of it forward with any particular effort. It carries itself exactly as it always has, long before tonight and long after. Somewhere right now, as you rest here, that fog is likely gathering again along its usual stretch of coastal hillside, arriving whether or not this particular night happens to be a clear one. Somewhere, a single drop of moisture is beading slowly along the edge of a lichen thread, growing heavy enough, eventually, to finally fall. Somewhere, deep beneath the gravel of a plain that hasn't bloomed in years, a seed continues waiting in exactly the same patient stillness it has held the entire time, prepared for a storm that might arrive next year or might not arrive again for a decade, indifferent either way to how long the waiting actually takes. And somewhere above all of it, that same sky we lay beneath earlier tonight continues holding its impossible number of stars in place, steady and unblinking, exactly as clear tonight as it will likely be tomorrow, and the night after that, and every night reaching forward for as long as this particular stretch of dry coastline continues sitting exactly where it sits, squeezed between an ocean too cold to offer much and a mountain range too high to let much through. Further inland, beneath a plateau still cooling from the day's heat, an observatory dome sits closed for now, waiting for full dark before it opens again to gather whatever faint light happens to arrive from somewhere considerably further away than any of us will ever travel ourselves. And out at the salt flat's edge, a shallow brine pool holds its reflection of that same darkening sky, steady, undisturbed, exactly as it has held it every quiet evening for longer than anyone standing beside it could properly account for. None of it is finished. None of it is waiting to be finished either. The salt will keep thickening, slowly, wherever a shallow pool happens to gather, and eventually surrender itself back to the sky. The wind will keep working at whatever soft stone it happens to find, one grain at a time, for however many more centuries it takes to finish whatever shape it's currently working toward. The fog will keep arriving most mornings, faithfully, along whatever narrow band of hillside still happens to catch it. And somewhere, eventually, after however many quiet years happen to pass, rain will fall again across those same gravel plains, and colour will spread once more across ground that, until that exact moment, gave no outward sign of holding anything at all. This is simply what this particular stretch of the world does. It waits, precisely, and it responds exactly as much as its circumstances allow, and then it returns to waiting again, without complaint, without hurry, without any need for anyone to be watching in order to keep doing exactly what it's always done. There's nothing left to explain about any of it now. No further mechanism worth tracing. No further chapter waiting further down whatever path we might have kept following tonight. We've come all the way from the mountains that first cast this coastline into shadow, down through the salt, the stone, the fog, the seed, and back out again to this same wide, quiet view, holding the whole shape of it gently in mind one final time before letting it go. Let that same quality settle over you now, the way it settles over every grain of sand still resting undisturbed somewhere out across that pale coastline tonight. There's nothing more you need to gather from any of this. Nothing more you need to hold on to, or carry forward, or remember clearly by morning. You can simply let it rest, the way the desert itself rests, patient and unhurried, needing nothing at all from the world around it except permission to continue exactly as it already has for as long as it possibly can. The ground is still out there right now, holding the same shape it held when we first arrived at the coast so many hours ago. The salt is still crystallizing at its own unhurried pace. The stars are still steady overhead, indifferent to whether anyone is left awake to look up at them. And somewhere, quietly, a single grain of sand continues resting exactly where it has always rested, needing nothing more from tonight or from tomorrow than to simply remain exactly as it is. Good night. Sleep well.